And then, in the second part of today's lecture, we'll be talking about our final project. So to learn about ECG, we need a little knowledge in cardiac electrophysiology. Uh, our heart has four chambers: the left atrium, right atrium, left ventricle, and the right ventricle. So there are a lot of reasons why we need four chambers instead of just one chamber. So, if you're interested, refer to, some extra reading, but I'll just, describe this in a very, very, very simple, overly simplified terms. Okay. So, basically, the left and right atrium will contract to push blood into the left and right ventricles. Then next, the left and right ventricles will contract to push blood into arteries. So a very simple description here. And then so in terms of electrical activities, everything starts with pacemaker cells. So these are the cells in the right atrium. So these are called the SA node. So we have the SA node, which has pacemaker cells. So they generate electrical impulses. Then they travel through, atrial muscles, and then they arrive at, another node called the AV node. This is the AV node. So between the SA and AV nodes, they are internodal pathways. These are essentially specialized atrial fibers, for conduction. And a very important thing to note about the AV node is that electrical impulses travel very, very, very slowly along the AV node. They travel very slowly. And the reason here is that, we want to make sure that, the atria has sufficient time to contract and push blood into the ventricles before the ventricles contract. So there's a long delay at the AV node just to make sure the atria has sufficient time to push blood into the ventricles. Then once the electrical impulses travel past the AV node, then they will go on to something called the His bundle. Then the His bundle branches into two branches called the Purkinje fibers. Then ultimately, the impulses will arrive at the ventricular muscles. So at that point, the ventricular muscles will contract to push blood. This is a very high-level description. Then we can look at this process in another way in the plot on the right. You will see everything starts at the SA node. Action potential is generated at the SA node. Then it travels through atrial muscle, then arrive at the AV node. They arrive at the AV node, and we see that it takes a really long time for the impulses to travel past the AV node and arrive at the His bundle. This is a long delay we need to make sure, blood is pushed from, atria to ventricles. So then, they arrive at His bundle, Purkinje fibers, and ultimately at, ventricular muscle. And when we measure ECG, we are measuring the overall activity of the heart. So that means we are, measuring the overall activity of, different parts of the heart. So we are essentially, measuring the superposition of all these signals. So when you add these signals together, you get ECG. And in ECG, we have three prominent segments: the P wave, QRS complex, and the T segment. P segment, QRS complex, and T segment. Three segments here. So there's a pretty good video on YouTube that tells you about the cardiac cycle. You can watch it after class. So this is still the same information, but shown in a different way. So again, everything starts at the SA node. then then electrical impulses travel through atrial muscle, then they arrive at the AV node. So this is the atrial excitation process. And during this process, the atria will contract to push blood into ventricles. So this phase corresponds to the P segment of ECG. The next, the impulses will travel past the AV node and arrive at the His bundle and Purkinje fibers and so on and so forth. So in this phase, the ventricles are excited, then they contract to push blood to, the aorta and the pulmonary artery. So this is the ventricular excitation phase, and this is also the atrial relaxation phase. So they are the same, they happen at the same time. So in this phase, we have the QRS complex. Then finally is the ventricular relaxation phase, during which we have the T segment. So three phases in total: atrial excitation, ventricular excitation plus atrial relaxation, then finally ventricular relaxation. And that corresponds to three different waves or segments in ECG, including the P, QRS, and the T. And still the same information, and but we focus on ECG here. See? So the P segment corresponds to atrial excitation, and the QRS complex corresponds to ventricular excitation. Then finally, the T wave corresponds to ventricular relaxation. So when we look at ECG, we are primarily looking at the features of the three segments: P, QRS, and T. All right, so our